Hi. So as people flood in, I want to welcome you back to our second week with my social psychologist colleague, Daryl Van Tongeren. Last week, I told you about his remarkable achievements, his more than 200 publications, his millions of dollars in grants. What I didn't mention is one of the ways in which he does it. He commended last week, as part of his talking about humility, giving recognition to others who also deserve credit for one's achievements. And he's a practitioner of what I think of as team science. Almost everything that Daryl does is as part of a team of people. In science, as in nature, often the pack is greater than the wolf, and Daryl Van Tongeren operates as part of a wolf pack, don't you? And sometimes the wisdom of the crowd is greater than the wisdom of the individual. Well, you probably, if you're reading the religious news, aware of the dramatic increase in basically the secularization of America, which has lagged the secularization of Europe, the increase in religious nuns, so to speak, those who answer that they have none or no religious affiliation, or the religious duns, the formerly religious who are now done with religion. And people are wondering, how big is this phenomenon? Who's involved? Why are people religiously de-affiliating? And what can the church, both nationally and locally in places like this, do about it? So I don't lay the answer to all those questions on you, Daryl, but those are some of the questions that made us want to invite Daryl to think deeply about this, because he is thinking deeply about this. He's received a major research grant to study the phenomenon. He's writing about it in a forthcoming book that you can tell us how far along that project is. And he'll be eager, I'm sure, to hear our questions and to test drive some of his material this morning. So welcome back, Daryl Van Tongeren.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. I'm grateful to be here. I also want to start with gratitude, like Dave mentioned. This work is supported by a large grant from the John Templeton Foundation that I got in 2018. And I also want to thank, this research was actually inspired. I was going on a run with one of my colleagues at Hope College in 2017. And I had put in my materials for tenure, and he said, what's the one thing you've always wanted to study but you're kind of nervous about studying? And I said, well, I want to study why people are leaving religion. And he said, well, why have you been so nervous to study that? And I said, well, I teach at Hope College. Do I really want to spend all these years looking at why people are becoming disaffected and actually leaving religion? And so I'm grateful to Peter Baumgarten for encouraging me to have some courage to study something that was scary to me. So, speaking voice is too quiet. Okay, I'll try to speak up. I'm going to try to provide you with 7 big ideas. We'll see how far we get, because I really want this to be interactive. And I've tried to just summarize the science. If any of you want to read them, they're also a non-pharmacological cure for insomnia. They will put you to sleep. So I will trust you. I will have you trust me. The science is there, and I'll just try to summarize them. Because what I want to do is have this be a very practical talk. I want this to be something where you can kind of understand what's going on and think, what is something that we as a church can do? So the 7 big ideas, I'm going to talk about the 4 horsemen of religion's apocalypse, and it's not the 4 horsemen you're actually thinking about. I'm going to talk about the different ways people are leaving religion. I'm going to talk about the diversity of religious duns, something that my colleagues and I coined called religious residue, how many duns are seen as a sheep in wolf's clothing. I promise you that's not a typo. It's not supposed to say a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is actually supposed to say a sheep in wolf's clothing. I'm going to share a little bit of research my students and I did that we call To Hell with the Devil. And then finally, how to embrace the religious duns, what the church can do practically. All right, so the first big idea, there are 4 horsemen for what I think are predicting religion's apocalypse in the United States. So as Dave mentioned, there are some pretty alarming religious trends that I think as a community of faithful followers should attend to. And one is that over the past 30 years, the number of Christians in the US has dropped from 90% to 63%. And Pew Research projects that by 2070, Christianity will no longer be the majority religion in the US. Now, as Dave mentioned, this is the rise of the nones, right? The people who, when asked, what do you identify as, they say, well, none, nothing in particular, I've no religion. But of these nuns, 78% were raised religious, according to Pew Research. Okay, so we're talking 4 out of 5 were raised in some type of religious faith, household tradition, and left. And in fact, 1 in 3 individuals raised Christian will leave their faith by the time they reach 30. So something's going on, right? It's this secularization Dave's talking about is a lot of folks leaving religious traditions. So my colleagues and I call these folks, these nuns who leave religion, we call them duns, because they're done with religion. And they're done because they no longer identify as religious. But people have asked, well, why are people leaving religion? So I'm going to share what I think are 4 compelling reasons why people are leaving religion. And you may or may not agree, but this is based on my research and research of others. And so let's look at, and I call them the 4 horsemen. So let's look at the 4 horsemen. So the first reason, or the first horseman, why I think people are leaving religion is something that I call cultural stagnation. And by cultural stagnation, I think that a number of people are leaving religion because they perceive that religion's beliefs and teachings are antiquated, outdated, or downright oppressive. Okay, so individuals are becoming increasingly more progressive, and the perception is that their churches and their church's values and teachings are lagging behind. And so when they perceive this religious institution as holding values that are kind of at odds with their own personal progressive values, they ask themselves, well, why am I participating in or supporting or upholding a system that's not as progressive? So usually these are issues around LGBTQ plus communities, views of women, racial and ethnic minorities, the predominance of the patriarchy, restrictive views on gender and sexuality. Right? And I'm not saying that every church holds the same beliefs on these issues, but I think many of us would agree this has kind of become a tension point for folks, right? In some churches, they say, well, this is what we teach and believe. Other individuals are saying, well, that's not what I believe, so I'm going to leave. So the first horseman, why people are leaving, is cultural stagnation. A second reason why people leave is religious trauma. Okay, so many people experience deep religious and spiritual hurt, including some people who have experienced religious trauma and abuse. Now, this trauma and abuse could actually be trauma and abuse perpetrated by religious leaders, right, that they themselves have experienced. They might have witnessed it locally. They might have witnessed it globally. In some of our research, some participants said, well, after the scandal with the Catholic Church, I just can no longer, in good faith identify as a Catholic anymore. And other folks were punished for doubting, questioning, or not fitting into the moral standards of their religion, right? So they were like, oh, I have these questions, or I'm not quite sure. And they were told, oh, you just need to have more faith. Or they were, they didn't fit the moral norms of religious teaching, and they were forced to do some pretty egregious things in order to kind of recompense their own immorality in front of other folks, and they realized that was actually pretty oppressive, having me get up and claim all my sins before all these people who are equally as sinful as I am. Okay, so the second is religious trauma. The third horseman is something that I call simplistic views of suffering. So when many churches have a very thin theological view of suffering. And in that, we could call this toxic positivity, or we could call this the prosperity gospel. This one is kind of, is a little personal for me. My wife and I wrote a book on finding meaning in the midst of suffering. And in that, we kind of share some of our own life story and life history. And one of the worst things that you can do, so if you're writing down things to do, just make a new column, things not to do. So if someone's going through adversity or suffering, don't try to make sense of it in a way that upholds your worldview. That's probably not the worst thing you can do. So if someone loses a loved one, don't say, oh, God needed another angel. It's like, no, they needed a sibling or a parent or a friend, So what happens is a lot of religions offer really simple accounts for human life. Right? And in some religious traditions, the idea goes something like this. God blesses those that God loves, right? So when life is going good, what does that mean? Well, I must be loved by God. I'm doing the right thing. Now, that's all well and good most of the time. But then when life falls apart or life doesn't go the way you want it to go, you don't have to be terribly good at algebra to realize if you reverse the equation, when life doesn't go well, does that mean that God no longer loves you? Or maybe even worse than that, does it mean that you did something to kind of implicate God's wrath? Right? Because if you do believe that God's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, did God cause this? Did God not really love me? Right? Could God have stopped this and decided not to? You kind of get down into this theological wormhole, right? Theologians call this, or philosophers call this theodicy, right? The problem of evil. And so when churches have overly thin views of suffering, I think that drives people out. And then the fourth is a problematic label. So I think the fourth reason why people are leaving religion is because the term religion, and especially in the US, the term evangelical, is problematic. And so after 2016, I think that, and I don't think I'm alone, I think many of us would agree the term evangelical became an increasingly polarized and politicized term. Dave shared with me some research that I'm sharing with you. In 2022, so a year ago, a poll revealed that 40% of evangelicals do not believe in Jesus as God. Some of you are like, I think I'm confused. I am also confused. Considering the deity of Jesus has been a central tenet, if not the central tenet, of evangelicalism, since its inception, it begs the question, well, what does evangelical actually mean in the hearts and minds of Americans, right? And so it's probably shifting more from being solely a religious label to being either a religious political kind of combined label or maybe even more of a political label. So I know folks who after 2016 said, I don't know what that is, but whatever that is, I'm not that, right? And so then they have to start asking themselves, well, what am I? Okay, so we have cultural stagnation, religious trauma, simplistic views of suffering, and a problematic label. This is about as depressing as it gets. We will get better. But I do think that it's important for us to realize why people are leaving, right? And I think it's also important for us to ask ourselves what role, what complicity do we play in kind of nudging folks out of wanting to be religious, right? And so, yes, we have a question already, which I love.
I'm Dawn. Are there problematic labels among Muslim communities and Jewish communities, or is that particularly germane to Christianity?
No, that's a great question. I think that there are problematic labels about religion in general. So some people say, oh, I don't want to be religious because some people, and you might know some of these people, you might be one of these people, don't like any labels at all. And so they say to be in that label feels constraining to me. And so I do think that there are problematic labels in other religious groups as well. But I think in the US, the flashpoint is probably evangelical. Yeah, great question. Okay, so 4 reasons why people are leaving. All right, big idea number 2. There's actually different ways to leave religion. So I'm going to just show you, so this is, as the kids say these days, these are my receipts, right? So this is basically the evidence that we actually did some of this research published in peer-reviewed journal articles. So my colleague Nathan DeWall and I basically conceptualized that there's 4 different ways that people might leave religion because we were just building on previous research that suggested there's actually 4 different ways to kind of be religious. So many religious people believe in some type of supernatural agents or God, right? So one way people can de-identify is by disbelieving. Many religious people engage with God, right? Engage in worship or prayer or meditation, some type of relational engagement. So another way that people can leave religion is just by disengaging, right? By stopping that relational connection. A third way that people are religious is they follow the morals of religion. So religion says you should do these things, you shouldn't do those things. One way people can leave religion is by saying, I'm no longer going to listen to religion's moral mandates on my life. And then the last way, this is probably the way most people think about leaving religion or de-identifying, is what's called disaffiliation, right? So most religious people are part of a religious community, and so another way that you can de-identify or leave religion is by disaffiliating, by no longer going to church, right? So there's that book coming out, like the de-churching of America, right? So all these people are leaving church. Now, why do I bring this up? It's actually because I think you can leave religion on some domains and not others, right? So I think a number of people have left church, but they haven't stopped believing in things, right? And so I actually think that what we're going to see in the next 10, 20 years is a really strong uptick in post-religious spirituality. So people who say, I'm not that interested in church, but I find my connection with the transcendent in these other ways. Some of you might have also found that during COVID. You couldn't go to church. You're like, well, I have to find other ways of kind of connecting with God. How can I do that? This also means that there might be people who have not yet disaffiliated, but might no longer believe or no longer engage, and they're among us, right? But they're there. I talked with a pastor. I went to a conference of people who were undergoing changing faith, and it was all about kind of what do you do with religious struggles. And he confided to me, this is a true story, he said, the only other person I've told this to is my wife, but I stopped believing years ago as a pastor. And I said, well, I appreciate the confession, but why continue to be a pastor? And very pragmatically, he said, retirement, right? Well, he said, financially, he said, I'm at a place in my life that I can't do a career change. I can't leave. I can't go find another job. I can't give up everything that I've put in here. I know the words to say. Does it really matter if I don't personally believe, if I can go through all the motions with my church? And so I actually think, well, maybe it is getting a little darker. I actually think that the kind of increase of religious duns might be even more than we're identifying. It might be even a deeper problem, a stronger case than we're actually even capturing with some of our polling data. And so if any of this is making you feel uncomfortable, I do think there are things that we can do. I do think there are ways that we can authentically engage this. Now, because I feel like some of you are already getting kind of anxious on me, I'm gonna go ahead and give my kind of surprise, I don't want to bury the lead too much. I'm actually wondering, and I don't think that this is too heretical, part of me wonders if what we're experiencing is a necessary revolution, right? So as folks are leaving religion, maybe we actually need to think about if that's okay, and what are ways that we can redefine and kind of rethink about religion, right? I don't know that this is necessarily a bad thing if what it's asking us to do is reconceptualize ways to engage people, to have more authentic relationships with God and each other. To me, that seems very invitational. That feels much less like, let's hit the panic button. That feels much more like, let's get creative about ways that we can, pursue God's kingdom. I shared this research with some folks, and they laughed at me, and they said, I'm not worried that the church will disappear. Because the church is not a building, it's not an identification, it's not a group of people. The church is the Holy Spirit, and that's not really going to go anywhere. It might look different than it looks right now, but I'm not too concerned. Okay, you don't need to see that model. Okay, big idea number 3. There are actually different types of duns, like we talked about. Some colleagues and I did a research study to kind of figure out different types of duns. And we asked the reasons for leaving that kind of mapped onto those 4 horsemen and confirmed some other research that we had seen. But one of the things that was really interesting, I want to kind of key you into those 2 groups. So some duns are discontinuing. So they're kind of like done, like they're really done. Okay, like believe me, I'm done. Then there's the still practicing duns. Okay, that's the group we were really interested in. The still practicing duns have told us, I'm no longer religious. But when you look at their behavior, they're still going to church, they're still praying, they're still kind of doing all this stuff that you might imagine. Their mental health is so much worse than people who are actually done. And some of you are like, really? Yes, they are not reaping the benefits, all the great benefits of religion, by sticking around in a system that's not congruent with their beliefs and worldview. And so they're experiencing all this cognitive dissonance, all this, mismatch, all this inconsistency. And so They're more anxious. They have less positive affect, more negative affect. They report worse depression or greater depression. They have more negative emotions toward God. So it's not a good situation. It's tough on somebody if they've kind of privately checked out, but they're still publicly involved. And again, these folks may be among us. Right, big idea number 4. We're just cruising, which is going to allow us to have a lot of good time for discussion. One of the biggest findings from our 5-year kind of research program on religious duns is something that we call religious residue. So religious residue is basically this idea that after people leave religion, many of their religious tendencies, thoughts, emotions, behaviors stick with them. And it's actually kind of hard to leave religion. It's not as easy as just being like, oh, now I'm no longer religious. You check the box, and you never think about God, right? You never consider praying ever again. And so we did cross-cultural research, thousands of people, over 5,000 people from the US, Netherlands, Hong Kong, another like 30,000 people from New Zealand. And here's the idea. Once people have left religion, there's all of these psychological reasons why religion sticks with them. So one is cognitively. You kind of have these worldviews, these ways of seeing the world. Psychologists call them schemas. That's just like a lens through which you kind of understand and make sense of the world. They're really, really hard to change. Even when you get counterfactual evidence, you don't change them, right? You're just like, oh, that's an interesting exception. I'll never change my belief. So if you were raised religious, okay, religion is the schema, the way that you see the world. Even after you've left, it's not like your neural pathways got the update, right? And so you're continuing to see the world in religious ways. So you'll have this religious residue persist. A second reason is that a lot of religion is kind of ritualized habits. Wake up Sunday, come at 9:30 a.m., listen to the guy talk about either humility or religion, right? There's all these kind of ritualistic behaviors. They become these automatized habits, and habits are really hard to break. So I've been around folks who were raised religiously, they no longer believe in God, and right when the meal comes out, what do? They're like, oh, I don't believe in it, right? But it's like so automatic that they want to pray. The third reason why religious residue persists is that a lot of folks are still embedded in religious communities, right? A big tension is kind of this generational gap where parents might be religious and kids are not, right? Then they go home for Thanksgiving, it's a big blowout, right? And being embedded in social communities kind of keeps that religious residue persistent. So why do I bring this up? Why is this important for you to know? First, I think it's a really cool finding. Second, why I think it's important to know is that once people leave religion, I think that you continue to see the persistent effects manifest in different ways. And so remember, last week, for those who were here, we talked about kind of rearranging your prejudices. So you believe one thing really strongly, and then if you change your mind, you just kind of believe something else really strongly, and you've just rearranged the target of your vitriol. After people leave religion, and this is kind of controversial, many of them become religious about something else, something non-religious, or what I like to call like religious adjacent, right? And so they get really into Peloton, for example. I know that seems odd, but there's a Peloton instructor, Allie Love. Sunday morning, she has Sundays with Love. And for 8 or 12 weeks, they focused on a virtue. And that morning, you log on live with thousands of people from all over the world, and they had certain virtues, and you're biking with people you've never met, but you're kind of focusing on a virtue. Or some people get really into the Enneagram, or all these different other kind of religious adjacent ideas, and it becomes their new religion. Or they're like, wow, I'm so glad I left religion. I don't want people telling me what to do. Now, if I can only find a guru or life coach to give me guidance, same thing, right? It's the same thing. Okay, we find this explicitly. So when we ask people to give self-report measures, we find this implicitly. So when we just have people respond as fast as they can using a process that psychologists call the implicit associations test, We find this behaviorally with how much they volunteer, how much they donate money. We find this in multiple cultures. Yeah, you can trust us. Anyway, so yeah, we can get through that. So we also see this with morality. So this is something that was really fascinating. We see this with morality in that religion and conservative morals kind of go hand in hand. But after people leave religion, there's still kind of those puritanical beliefs are kind of sticky. Those are the ones that are hard to leave. And I know last week I said a lot of people kind of get, they leave fundamentalist religion and they get really kind of fundamentalist about liberal politics. But I think they do it in a very puritanical way. You have to believe everything I believe or you're out, right? It's ideological purity. You're all for us or you're against us. We don't want you to have any friends on the other side. Your parent voted for who? I don't know about that. I don't know if you can be my friend. One thing we did find is something called residual decay. So how long does this religious residue last? A long time. And I think some of this religious residue will kind of always be with folks, but it does decay over time. The longer folks are away from religion, the less the effect. Then we decided to do what any good academic does, and that's when you have an effect, you just chase it. And that's your hammer and everything's a nail. And so we also found it with personal values. So we have people kind of report their personal values. And we found the folks that have the most residue are American evangelicals. They're the ones that it's the hardest for them to shake their values. We even found it with consumer behavior. So religious duns are still more willing to spend money on religious items, which seems strange. Like, why would they? It's that habitualized kind of process that they're so used to doing. It's hard to shake. So we see it in religion, morality, values, behavior. See it all over the place. Okay, big idea number 5. Big idea number 5, a sheep in wolf's clothing. So you all have heard the Bible verse, beware of the wolf in sheep's clothing who comes to you, but inwardly are ravenous wolves, right? And it's like, oh, we gotta pay attention to the person who seems like we can trust, but inside they're trying to dissuade us. We were quite curious, how do religious people view religious duns? And how do people who've never been religious view religious duns? And how do religious duns view other people? So we did another 6 studies, another 5,000 people. And we wanted to try to figure out how they were perceived. I'll just kind of jump ahead to the key findings. The key findings are this. Religious people really like religious duns. They're like, oh, you're still part of our team. You're still part of our group, okay? Religious duns do not like religious people. They're like, I have left your team for a reason. The group they really like are the never religious. Okay, so they want to start identifying, they really like the people who have never been religious ever. The never religious, they don't like and they don't trust the religious duns. They're like, oh, you've been religious before. Nope, I don't trust you. So they've got this, they're seen as a sheep in wolf's clothing. So outwardly, they're projecting this non-religious identity. But the never religious folks, and we ask them, they don't trust them. They're like, nope, nope, you've been religious. And the currently religious, they like them. And the reason why they like them is because they think they're coming back. And in fact, they don't actually think they've changed. And so they're like, you're going through a phase. And the duns, when we have data on this, the duns say, we're not coming back. We're done. And so what does this actually mean? What's the practical upshot of this? I think religious duns are uniquely isolated right now. So religious duns, the group they really want to be with, they're never religious, want nothing to do with them. The group that wants them to hang out, they don't want anything to do with them. So they're pretty lonely. They're pretty isolated. And so a lot of religious duns will go hang out with other religious duns. But a lot of what they spend their time doing is what psychologists call co-rumination. So you get together and you're like, wow, we sure escaped a pretty horrible religious system, didn't we? Yeah, can you believe this? Which is fine, and in the beginning, it's good to kind of talk about your experiences. Lay people call it trauma bonding, right? You're kind of like, whoa, that was awful. But if your whole identity is co-ruminating over a previous identity, that can get kind of exhausting. And after a while, your identity just gets stuck on what you're not, right? I'm not religious, but it doesn't really get fleshed out as to what you what you are, like what you stand for, who you are, because you're more than just those beliefs. So duns are pretty lonely. Okay, big idea number 6, to hell with the devil. Hopefully that's not too close to swearing. Okay, so what we wanted to do is we also wanted to see if religious residue was present for negative things in religion too. So for those of you who aren't aware of academia, it's kind of a mean place. So I was presenting this research at a conference and someone raises their hand and they said, that's great, but all you focus on are the good things of religion that are sticking around. Is there anything bad about religion that sticks around? And I'm like, oh, okay. So my wife's a therapist. She sees a number of people undergoing religious change. And one day, she was kind of mentioning to me that the one kind of persistent thing that people who have left religion just can't shake is the fear of hell and the devil. Because think about this. What if you're wrong? Right? Ooh, that is not something to be wrong about, right? You can be wrong about which sports team to cheer for. You can even be wrong about which politician to vote for. You do not want to be wrong about the afterlife, right? The afterlife is a lot longer than 4 years or 8, right? You don't want to be wrong about the afterlife. And so this was all Sarah's idea. So at dinner, Sarah was like, you should run a study about that. And I said, okay. And then I went to my students, I said, we should run a study about this. And they're like, okay, so we ran a study about this. So in psychology, there's this idea called the negativity bias, or bad is stronger than good. And that means that we pay more attention to negative or bad things than positive. So we were wondering, might it be that it's really hard to shake this fear of hell and the devil if you've left religion? And the answer is yes. So religious duns retained a greater belief in hell, the devil, those negative features of religion, much more so than people who were never religious. And just to prove that these were actually duns, when we even look at the atheist duns, right? Most of the duns, like 89% were atheist, and most of the never religious were atheists. Even among atheist duns, they still believe in hell and the devil more than people who were never religious. So people would much quicker give up their belief in God than hell or the devil, because you just don't want to be wrong, right? You don't want to be wrong about that thing, and it can exist, and then you're paying the rest of your life for that mistake. Okay, now let's get to what can we do as a church to embrace the duns. Well, the first thing is I think that we can be really attentive to avoid cultural stagnation. Right? Let's not be a group that so strongly misses the mark on meeting the kind of evolving needs of our community and of our culture, right? And I think, I think it might be safe to say that you all do a pretty good job of that at Hope Church. And maybe there are ways that all of us could get better at that as well. The second is, I think as an entire people of faith, we need to be attentive to protect against religious abuse and trauma. While I was writing this book, and it's coming out, the publishers have it, they're giving me all those line edits, the reviewers are looking at it. So it's in press, they'll figure out the revisions, it'll probably come out next spring. So this summer I was researching this book, and I watched a lot of documentaries on like religious abuse and trauma, like the Hillsong documentary. There's one called Happy Shiny People. That's just a lot to watch and all the time. Anyway, one of the patterns is that a lot of religious systems will kind of sweep religious abuse and trauma under the rug to perpetuate the system, because they think, well, if we admit that there's something wrong, that's much worse than doing the right thing, right? I would also encourage us to develop theologically rich views of suffering, and let's avoid toxic positivity. It's okay to say, I don't know. Well, why did God have this happen? Beats me. No clue. You are welcome here, though. Right? We have donuts and coffee, right? You don't have to provide everyone's theologically complete worldview. Now, some of you are actually paid to do that as religion professors, but for most of us, the rest of us, we don't have to do that. And in fact, it's much better when we don't, and we just sit with people in their suffering. I think that we have the opportunity to rewrite the label. Now, some of you might say, well, I want to get rid of that label. And that's fine. Well, then rewrite a new label. Right? What if we were a group that was committed to writing a label that people wanted to be part of, right? Not because it was exclusive, not because it signaled some type of, kind of affiliation, but because the way we lived our life was so inviting and so marked by love and humility that people said, that's what I want to be part of. I think we need to understand that all duns are different, right? Duns are all different. So don't leave this and be like, I know everything there is to know about duns, right? When you leave, understand everybody is kind of struggling with something different who's no longer identifying as religious. And there's many different ways that you can be done. Acknowledge that their change is real, right? If we see that they're already seen as a sheep in wolf's clothing, if we already see that they're feeling isolated, don't convince them they're just going through a phase. You had the same thing in college. Embrace them where they're at. Acknowledge that their change is real. And then finally, I mean, I don't really have any better thing to say than, can we just centralize love, right? Can we just centralize an authentic love for who people are and where they're at, regardless of what they believe, regardless of kind of their identification or affiliation. And that's kind of the best suggestions I can offer. I welcome a discussion for the remainder of the time. Thanks.
My name is David Young. Question I have is, I think we all remember 9/11. It's recent, and clearly the churches became filled for about 3 months afterwards. And has anybody studied that? And what was the reason for? I mean, it's common sense. We all think we have the answer, but you're in the area of research. Has somebody actually looked at why people came running back to churches and then departed shortly thereafter? Second question I have is, what about more of the, and I have to use this with caution, but the cultish types of Christian groups, such as I don't want to say the Mennonites, but where there's more of a grouping of people, and have they seen duns and so on, and have the Mormons likewise seen duns, fallouts, and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to your first question, I mean, I think there were a number of reasons why kind of after 9/11 churches filled up. I think, a sense of community, I think a sense of camaraderie. I mean, there's some research that suggests that 9/11 was this giant existential threat. It reminded all of us that we're going to die one day. The thing that solves that problem better than anything else is religion, right? It promises this kind of afterlife. And then, so religion kind of addressed all those existential concerns, and then after a while, people kind of got their needs met elsewhere and kind of trickled off. Sometimes some of those really insular groups, right, the groups where the really high behavioral commitment groups, do a fairly good job of retaining their members because the stakes of leaving are so incredibly high, right? So for some people, leaving religion, it's like, check a different box on the census. For other people, it's like, I can't see my family anymore, my finances have been seized, I actually have to go live in a different part of the country or world. So I mean, I do think we are seeing some people leave, but a lot of those insular groups do a fairly decent job kind of retaining their folks.
Second question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dave, yeah.
So I'm Dave. If I were C.S. Lewis's Senior Devil's Screwtape, and I wanted to design a strategy for encouraging religious disengagement and de-affiliation, I think I would want to use your language, have some manipulation that would break the religious habit. COVID seems to me to have been that manipulation, because for a year or two, people were simply disengaged the habit of being actively religious. We were online, but it wasn't anything like the experience we're having together right this morning.
Yeah.
So I know the religious trends predated COVID. What do you see to be the impact of COVID? And how can churches reach out to people to draw them back in who disengaged pre to post-COVID?
Yeah, that's such a good question because, like Dave said, the trends were already there. And then COVID was like an accelerant. COVID was almost like an accelerant for lots of things, but it also accelerated this. I'll draw from a personal example. So when my wife and I went to grad school, when we first went to grad school, we were going to a church, and then my wife's a pastor's kid, and she, there was some stuff going on in the church, and she said, hey, do you mind if we kind of take a break from going to church? And I said, let's take a break. Let's do that. But we became part of a small group. But when we went, and the small group had the pastor of a local church, and they were our friends, but we said, we are only going to your small group. We will not go to your church. Are you okay with that? And they said, yes. And for years, we never once felt an ounce of pressure to go to church. And in fact, when other people at the small group, like, why don't you come to church? They would fly across the room, and be like, no, don't ask them. So we were in a community, and we met every week, Thursday nights, for a couple hours. We would have dinner. And it was very, religious. It was meeting those needs. And then my brother passed away, like my last year of grad school, and we started going to the church because they were just there. And it was this kind of invitational, never pressuring. So I'm not sure that my sample size of 1 perfectly translates, but I do think that to the degree that it can be invitational, but not pressuring, especially because a lot of people who have been told what to do their whole life won't want to be told what to do again, and they'll want to return. And so what I haven't shared with you is I have been very fortunate to be able to kind of be on some different podcasts and chat with some different folks in interviews. And some folks have said, I was so angry at religion. And yeah, I'm still a dun, I think, but I really miss church. And I kind of miss, and I have kids now, and I want them to have a different experience. And so they're starting to go back very tentatively, right? A lot of anxiety about that. But they're going to places that were very just kind of, hey, yeah, invitational, you're welcome here.
A quick observation and then a question. The UU Church in Grand Rapids, Fountain Street Church, I've noticed is quite different from the one that I visited in Vermont, in Burlington. There you had people who were generationally UU, whereas at the Fountain Street Church, these are people who, as you say, they came from other churches in the area, and they spend their time identifying as who we are not. And also, interestingly, when they dedicate their children, they do it in the name of earth, wind, and fire, whatever it is, 3 things, and they sprinkle water. It's just the very same structure as religious, so that's kind of interesting. Here's my question. If asked, why is your rowboat floating out in the middle of the lake? One answer would be, well, the waves were lapping at it and pushed it out there, and the wind was kind of pushing it out there. Those were the things that maybe caused it to move. But maybe a better answer would be, I forgot to tie it up. And so similarly, to try to figure out why these people are out in the middle of the lake having been being duns, one way to maybe get at that would be to ask people who are still tied up, why are you remaining where you are? Why are the people in this room here? And find out what's the commonality here, or maybe it's more than one thing, that causes these people to remain, whereas others have moved away.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I love that. Thank you. Over here. Oh, great. Yep.
Thank you, David. I'm Dan Griswold, and my question might seem entirely methodological, but I assure you it is personal because I was the pastor of a church for 15 years and observed and tried to pastor to people who were in various stages of disaffiliation. And what occurs to me is that your 4 horsemen are kind of a herd. They run together.
Yeah.
And distinguishing one horse from another may not be so simple. So the reasons that people give, I mean, we all know that sometimes the stories we tell about ourselves are the best story we can come up with, but they may not actually be what's really at work. So how do you tease that out where the answers that people are giving may not be the real answer, or what's all that's going on for them, that there might be more than one horse running together?
Yeah, right. So and we don't give a multiple choice, like which horse are you riding out on? And it's possible that for many people, it's the amalgamation of all those things together. I think the best way we've found so far is to ask folks, right? In the same way, if like somebody left a relationship, we would ask them like, why'd you leave your relationship? And we'd probably try to trust that. And it is possible that upon reflection, when people get more time, that story might evolve. But I think as far as we can go right now, we kind of have to trust what folks are saying. Yeah.
I guess I was observing, thinking about like growing up in Holland, and when I grew up, everybody belonged to church. Maybe they probably went twice on Sunday, and people would watch their neighbors. You couldn't mow your grass, et cetera, et cetera. It was very strict. Our family went to the lake on Sunday afternoon, and they soon discovered, they thought, well, they must be Catholic. Wrong. But anyway, I think a lot of the things, if you were a car dealer, you would want to belong to a church so you would have clients that would buy cars. If you wanted somebody to go to your business, if you wanted to fit in any social group, you would have to belong to a church. And sometimes it had to be a specific church. And so I think when society changed, we had new people move in with GE, and I can't remember all the things that have gone on since. I think society in general gave these people who are leaving courage to leave because they found out that, well, the benefits really weren't there anymore. I don't have to do this. And so maybe just the people that were either committed to their church or whatever remained. So maybe part of it is just that we're freer now to make our own choice.
Yeah, they certainly can be the case. And I moved here in 2012, and it was a similar, someone had to tell me when I was mowing my grass on Sunday that we don't do that. And I was like, I have a pretty busy life, so if you want to mow it a different day, that's fine. And I do think, so there was one time I gave this talk, and a pastor just raised his hand, and his comment disguised as a question was one word, and he said, good. And when I asked, I was like, what do you mean good? He said, get the people who don't really actually believe out of here. We don't want them anyway. And so what he was saying is, this is a great, this is the wheat and the chaff, right? What we're losing are all the chaff. What we will have is a stronger, weedier, church when we get done. And so I think there is some sentiment among some folks who remain that like, yeah, that's fine. You kind of weren't, and I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I think among some, there's this idea that, yeah, you weren't really invested, times got tough, life is hard, hit the road. And I don't think it's that, especially from the folks I've talked to, the folks we've interviewed. This was a major part of their life. They made behavioral decisions. It's not easy for them to leave. Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Ruth, and I'm interested in more about this social isolation paradox. And in particular, you had something about trust up there, that these people who had never been religious didn't trust the Duns.
That's right.
Trust them about what? Can you give more depth to that, please?
Yeah, so this was just kind of a simple kind of like, how much do you trust these different groups? And they actually didn't trust the Duns even more than they didn't trust people who are currently religious. And I think there's something that signaled, it could have been, you were once religious and you've already changed once. Are you going to change again? Right? Like, are you going to leave? I think the lack of trust was that they weren't actually completely finished with their religion. And so they still wanted to maintain some space because they thought, well, maybe they're kind of secretly religious.
I'm Steve. 30 years ago, I was in a meeting of Reformed Church ministers and elders and staff, and a colleague made the comment, and this was 1994, that the church is moving toward irrelevance at the blinding speed of light. At that time, I thought that was a little hyperbolic. In retrospect, maybe not so. When did students such as you or faculty become aware of this trend of people leaving religion at a greater degree, perhaps, than previously?
Yeah, I think there's probably been a few prophets in the wilderness calling out for a while. I was certainly not the first. I'd probably say 7 years-ish or so, 7 to 10. I think it's become more accelerated. I think Pew Research has kind of put out some projections that kind of got people a little bit more alarmed when they were projecting. So some of the numbers I showed were kind of like modest projections. There are actually kind of more aggressive projections that might suggest it gets worse. And there's also some projections that suggest things are leveling out. And maybe what happened is we kind of lost like a big chunk of folks, right? Maybe it was folks that were born in the 80s and 90s who have kind of especially raised on a certain brand of American evangelicalism, and we're like, oh, that's not for me. So I think maybe about 7 to 10 years ago, folks started getting a little bit more alarmed. I mean, I read an article back in the 90s where somebody said, the Western church as we know it today will not exist in 50 years. And so we're about halfway there, and that's reading kind of prophetic as well.
Judy Parr, and I'm wondering if there's a correlation strongly between political changes maybe in the last 8 to 12 years in our country. This what we're seeing is really predominant in America, not so much in Europe. It's already had their secularization. Do you think that it's tied to maybe some strains of Christian nationalism that have pervaded the evangelical church?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I do think as Christian nationalism has become more studied and we have a label for it, we're understanding it more. And then I just went to a research talk in August from a scholar who works on Christian nationalism. And usually we thought it was just something we kind of talk about and we realize, and people are like, oh, that's a bad thing. And then he said there actually was someone who wrote a book making a case for Christian nationalism. And so now it's actually made a pivot to where it's becoming, they're kind of trying to get folks in and identifying and saying like, no, you should identify as a Christian nationalism, or as a Christian nationalist. And so as that happens, it seems to me that people are going to want more and more of that space.
So can you say some more about the demographics of who's leaving? Are certain denominations losing faster than others? And are certain age groups leaving faster than others?
Yeah, it seems more to be skewed younger. So it seems like more younger folks are tending to leave. We should look more at the denomination. We do have those data. We haven't looked particular at those denominations yet.
I'm Josh. I'm curious, the idea of like religious residue kind of resonates with me a little bit. I'm wondering if you've explored or have heard exploration of kind of like the shift from, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, from a conservative evangelical place to a congregation like this. And I certainly feel religious residue in the way that I approach a lot of things in my worldview now. And it creates quite a lot of tension in the way that I'm here, right? And so I'm wondering if there's been any exploration into that kind of within the church.
Yeah, so kind of staying within I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, only from personal stories, right? I chatted with folks and they said, I was kind of raised and this is how you did church. Now church is like this, and that feels very uncomfortable for many folks. Folks who are raised with a more kind of authoritarian view of God, and then they come to a view of God that's loving, and they're like, you're missing half of what's going on. So that would be a great place to look next, is kind of even folks who are like, I've had a huge shift, but I'm still sitting at the table, right? I haven't left the table, but I was on this side of the table, and now I'm on this edge of the table. And I think we might still see some of that residual residue sticking around.
Hi, I'm Don. I've been pounding on my good friend Dennis Voskuil for about 30 years about the religion department's lack of good theodicy, and I appreciate that you talk about that. I'd like to suggest 3 structural things that are very much interrelated that help me understand why this is happening now. And they may not be ones that are immediately evident. One is the pill. The second is the recession of death from our everyday life. And the third, all interrelated, are massive changes in life cycle patterns over the last 50 years. How does that play out? First, it takes away one of the ways in which religion had long had a strong hand in people's lives. That is, death was very prevalent. It takes away the threat of pregnancy that was also a strong emphasis on religion in religious circles. And frankly, it's one of those current political issues. Sexuality is not accidentally part of the scene. but it's not an issue in younger people's lives as it once was. The third has to do with the life cycle change, where people historically were married 18, 19, had children by 20, 21, had to get them into church or something soon, and baptism and all followed. Now they're getting married at 28, 29, or not getting married, having children or not having children, 32, 34. The break in pattern that Dave was referring to about what the pandemic has done. Now it's a 10-year break from participation in church, and it's not a part of their experience anymore. These are relatively recent phenomena, I would suggest, and they're not theologically bound in the sense that they are tied to any particular theological formulation or doctrinal approach. They're structural. They're part of our the sweep of current history. I don't think the church knows and understands that. I've said in a couple of settings, my grandfather was one of 10 children in his family. 5 of them left the church. But from his parents' generation to his generation, the church grew. I have 2 kids. The same ratio makes the church decline. So there's a pattern that's, again, structural that was not as visible, that was happening 100 years ago, but now becomes very apparent because it's happening to fewer people, fewer young people. And we see that in the trends in these membership things. That's my disguised question. How do you play with these structural issues that are beyond the church's control, in a sense?
Yeah, and there's no doubt you're absolutely right. Right, so there are these structural things, and I think functionally, sometimes the church functionally has been replaced by substitutions that can function in ways that the church has historically functioned. And there's no doubt, I love that you said the prominence of death, and I'll just leap on that real quick. But so although some functions of the church can be replaced by something else, there's actually something the church and religion does better than anything else, and that's answer these existential questions. And so that when people leave religion, I argue that they face what I call the existential chasm. So imagine you used to be religious, you had answers to what happens to me after I die, what makes for a good life, what's the meaning of life. After you leave religion, you don't have those answers anymore. But it's different than having never had those answers. It's like one time you've had chocolate cake and then you can never have it again. You know what chocolate cake tasted like, right? You know what you're missing. And so they had a deeper sense of grief and anxiety because they knew what it was like to believe in eternal life and all these different things. And then if that gets taken away, they have greater fear, grief, anxiety, things like that. What the church can do is focus on how religion does answer those existential questions better. Structurally, all those things you're saying are no doubt right. It's highlighting something that's been going on and might have been masked, and now it's, with smaller birth rates, it's kind of accelerating. But I do think that there are things that the church can do to highlight its unique contribution to human life.
I was hesitant because I don't remember if it was the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Atlantic, but there was an article about a man who was reared in the church and is now a dun, but has children of his own, and now is trying to find a place to engage. And it was really well written, and then it was responded on a number of different arenas as well, about I want the ritual, I want to gather, I want the coffee after the time, I want education for my children, and I want somebody to set it up for me.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming you've read that in our, extrapolate on that a little bit for me, please.
Without being too crude, they're like, I want the car without the engine, right? I want to get in, I want to sit down, I want to feel the steering wheel, I want to feel the leather, but I don't want to turn on and go anywhere, right? And there have been like atheist gatherings on Sunday mornings, and those have always petered out. They're like, let's get together and get donuts, right? And then it just kind of peters out. And so I think, I'm compelled a lot by how Dave Myers talks about religion, right? If people say, like, oh, religion is just, like if it's a hurricane, and you're like, no, it's just wind and water and storm surge. Right? That's the hurricane, right? And so what people are doing is they're saying, I don't want religion, I want everything that religion had before. It's like, well, you kind of want religion. And so I think we're just going to see these gaps. I think we're going to see these longings. I think we're going to be entering into seeing a period of spiritual longing and yearning, heightened, that we might not have seen in the past. Because I think that our need for spiritual connection is just innate. And I don't think that's going away. And I think that's an expression of this spiritual yearning. I want all this stuff, but I don't want it to be religion, but I kind of do. Right? I want it to be religion light. Don't tell me what to do or believe, but I want the donuts and the coffee.
One more question. One more comment.
Hello. I'm trying to organize my thoughts just a second. You're talking about something about like looking at a new way to see or understand religion before, and I've spent I spent the last five or so more years kind of looking at that same question myself, and I think I started to look at religion as a language, and I've been offering that idea as to people is because it offers a different way to connect with people. If you see religion as a language, something to be translated instead of something that is uniquely defined, and something that you can translate to something that is more universal instead of just one way of looking at it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Comment any?
No, that was great. And many people I appreciate that comment, many people who have left religion, they say they still feel conversant in their previous language, right? And so if they were raised in kind of a conservative religious household, their parents may say, I'm praying for you. Their new non-religious friends may say, sending you good vibes. Right, it kind of means similar things, right? It means like, I wish you well, right? And so sometimes people, when they leave religion, you can think about them as being kind of between two cultures, right? Kind of bilingual in terms of religious, non-religious language. So I appreciate that comment.
Daryl, we appreciate your coming to talk to us about humility and about the guns. We've learned so much. And I want to invite you to come back next week to hear our own George Kraft talk about his recent book, A Place to Call Home. He was the son of missionaries to inland China, and you come back and you'll hear his story. Come back next week.
Yep.
I was looking at it thinking, there's no place to